Dear learners, in the earlier class, we have gone through an introduction to the novel Felix Holt, the Radical. We have also examined the works of George Eliot. Now, in this class, let us study Felix Holt, the Radical as a political novel. Let us also look at the political commentary that Eliot put into the novel. The novel, as we all know, describes the events that occurred in Trebi Magna in 1832. The novel is classified under various categories, including the social novel, the political novel, and the social protest novel. The novel describes the political situation and documents the modes that candidates used to manipulate the elections. It also describes the way the lives of the main characters, including Harold Transome, Felix Holt, and Esther Lyon, are changed forever due to the elections. Now, let us read Felix Holt, the Radical as a political novel, a social novel, and a social protest novel. Before we discuss the main themes, let us examine the subgenres like social novel, political novel, and social protest novels. Eliot, we all know, was drawn towards liberal philosophy at a very young age. She was a journalist and an editor, hence she was well informed about the political situation in England. The novel, as we have discussed earlier, was published as England was debating the Second Reforms Act. In the Victorian period, the writings of many authors were influenced by the socio-economic and political situations. The social novel emerged as a popular subgenre, and some of the most memorable works of the 19th century are listed as social novels. These novels narrated the stories of English working classes and the rural poor. They depicted the condition of England as they focused on themes like education, suffrage, and other social issues. They accurately portrayed the horrible working conditions prevalent in factories, the despicable plight of child labor, and endangered women. These novels were aimed at sensitizing the rich and the middle class to the struggles of the lower classes. Charles Dickens, Elizabeth Gaskell Ruth are considered to be some of the best social novelists of 19th century. Political novels, on the other hand, are those works of fiction that narrate in detail the real or imagined political processes. They act as critiques of political formations, personalities, and ideologies. Most of the works of Anthony Trollope, George Orwell's Animal Farm and 1984, and even Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children are classified as political novels. A novel that accurately depicts social issues but does not offer solutions is termed a social protest novels. Thus, Felix Holt, the Radical, belongs to all the three subgenres. Since the novel narrates the events that occur over a 9-month period in the lives of inhabitants of Trebi Magna, a town caught up in the transformation from Old England of rural farmland associated with a rigid class structure, that of a New England of manufacturing affiliated with the breakdown of that structure, it can be described as a social novel. It documents the relationship between various economic classes, the dynamics of man-woman relationship, the struggles of the working class, and the role of religion. The novel also provides a commentary on the British electoral system. It acts as an accurate repository of political history. The election campaigns, the political alliances, and the voting processes are depicted very realistically. The events that occur in the novel justify the need to reform the political system. Hence, the novel can also be read as a political novel. Literary critics have also placed the novel under the social protest novel, as Eliot does not seem to offer any solutions to the existing domestic, social, or electoral problems. She seems to focus only on depicting the situation. Hence, one could also call the novel a social protest novel. Now, let us examine the main themes in Felix Holt, the Radical. George Eliot's work introduces many themes. The novel throws light on the social change in rural England, dynamic of class structure, the diminishing role of women in the 19th century England, and the role of religious ideologies. The first theme that the novel deals with is the transformation that has occurred in Trebi Magna since the Industrial Revolution. Within North Loamshire, a rotten borough, Trebi Magna has the highest number of voters. The village is exposed to the vagaries of industrialization, and migrant workers find employment within its vicinity. Due to migration, the population of the village increases. The social fabric is altered. The dissent church is strengthened. New tenants replace the old tenants, and the size of land holdings have decreased. Instead of peasants and artisans, workers constitute the bulk of the village's population. Such changes bring in new tensions. Eliot depicts these social changes convincingly. Her moving yet beautiful description of the social alteration affected by the Industrial Revolution is one of the main highlights of Felix Holt. The second theme that the novel deals with is the status of women amidst social transformations. The women in the novel, including Mrs. Transome, Mary Holt, and Esther Lyon, begin as strong characters. Each of them seems to have a strong personality and tries to hold on to her values. However, they are coerced by men around them to abandon their beliefs. Mary Holt, despite her protests, is unable to convince her son Felix to continue with the family trade. Mrs. Transome, who is the most comfortably placed woman in the novel, watches helplessly as the son Harold joins the Radical Party. She has no influence over Harold's activities and towards the end is disgraced as her extramarital affair with Matthew Jermyn is revealed. Esther is the most educated woman in the novel. She suffers humiliation at the hands of Felix. Under Felix's influence, she abandons her lifestyle, literary tastes, and dressing sense. The novel depicts that change in society and the advancement of technology does not lead to the empowerment of women. Eliot's novel describes the influence that religion had over the public life. In the election campaign, Reverend Rufus and Reverend DeBarry tried to generate goodwill for their respective political groups. The radicals are supported by the dissenters, while the Tories are supported by the Anglican Church. The influence of religion on the democratic processes is the third theme that Eliot's novel focuses on. The novel documents the unprincipled modes of campaign which are used during election processes. The voter is required to vote orally in the presence of the public. The voting process includes the candidates bribing and threatening the voter. The need for electoral reforms seems to be the fourth theme that Eliot addresses. It is interesting to note the timing of the novel's publication. The novel was being written as the modalities of the Second Reform Act were being discussed. The novel depicted the situation which prevailed during the First Reform Act. Thus, as Eliot tries to address many pressing issues through Felix Holt, the novel contains many themes. Now, let us analyze the class structure in Felix Holt the Radical. As we have noted earlier, most of the action in Felix Holt the Radical takes place in Treby Magna. Treby Magna is a part of the North Loamshire constituency which elects 2 representatives to the Parliament. Till the end of the 18th century, Treby Magna was a small village and agriculture was its mainstay. Most of the arable land in the village is owned by a few families. Members of the Transome family and the DeBarry family are the biggest landowners in the village. They rent out their land to small farmers and artisans. Till the 1870s, the elections in England were held through an oral vote. Thus, polling officials, agents and others who sat in the polling booth knew who had voted for whom. The landowners bribed and blackmailed the tenants to endorse their candidature. Tenants who did not comply with the directions of the landowners were evicted from their land. Thus, the tenants were in no position to benefit from their right to vote. Post the Industrial Revolution, the countryside in the Midlands was transformed rapidly. Industries were set up in the vicinity of Treby Magna and hence employment opportunities were created. Tenants and artisans began to seek employment in the factories. Additionally, a number of migrants arrived in Treby Magna to work in these industries. Thus, Industrial Revolution altered the demography of Treby Magna. Post Industrial Revolution, industrial workers or factory workers emerged as a new section. The workers were poor, but were independent of the landlords. Workers also brought their habits, cultures and religion into Trebi Magna, and the culture of the village was radically transformed. New institutions made it difficult for the landowners to manipulate the elections. The candidates were convinced that conventional modes of threat and bribery were not sufficient to influence the result of the election. Thus, Harold was forced to bribe the owners of the pub. His election agent, despite the fact that most of the workers were not enfranchised, got the workers drunk. Harold and his team depended on the vocal support of the workers to campaign in the village. However, on their farms, the conservative families sought to continue with the conventional order. Thus, Philip de Barry described Maurice Christian as a servant in a letter that he wrote. When Philip de Barry considered organizing a religious debate between Augustus de Barry, the head of the de Barry family, and Rufus Lyon, a lower class dissenting minister, Augustus de Barry scoffed at the possibility of participating in such an event. Augustus did not think that it was worth his while to engage in a debate with Rufus, and instead suggested the name of a junior clergyman. The poorer sections in Trebi mirror the prejudices of the upper classes. Maurice Christian, who would have been a gentleman but was nonetheless a servant, cruelly wondered how a poor man like Rufus could have fathered a beautiful Esther. Middle class women were unable to tolerate the pretty and refined Esther. They resented her and scoffed at her dress and manners. The social transformations also affected the dynamics within the families. Unlike in the agrarian society, where every member of the family, including women and children, worked, in the industrial society, men worked all day while women were confined to homes. It affected the relationship between men and women. Despite the difference in their economic class, Mrs. Transome and Mary Holt shared a similar predicament. They were marginalized within their families. Thus, as industrialization altered the culture in Trevi Magna, the dynamics between the classes and the sexes were affected. Now, let us examine the role of religion in Felix Holt the Radical. George Eliot's novel depicts the influence that the affairs of the church had on the national politics of England. Most of the landowners in England were followers of the Anglican Church, while the poor were a part of the puritanical churches. The tenants of most landowners also joined the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church in most villages was situated within the estate of the landed gentry. The gentry were its chief patrons. The priests and the rectors of these parishes were drawn mostly from the upper classes. The artisans and the peasants were affiliated with the independent or the Puritan churches. These parishes were situated on the outskirts of the village. Such churches were less grand in their appearance and were managed by a collective of its members. Since most members of the poorer classes supported the Chartists and the Radicals, the Puritans and the independent churches also supported such movements. In the novel, the politics of Trevi Magna is also influenced by the politics within the church. The Anglican Church, as we have already noted, was controlled by the members of the De Barry family. The bulk of its members were drawn from the estates of the De Barry families. The church itself was located on the premises of the De Barry estates. The Dissent Church, on the other hand, was situated on the periphery of Trevi Magna, and most of its members were petty traders, workers, artisans and tenant farmers. Reverend Rufus Leon is an important character, and he is the minister of the Dissenters. The radical candidate Harold, conscious of the control that Rufus wielded over the working classes, befriended Rufus. Despite the class difference, Rufus agreed to work for Harold. The religious debate, which was supposed to be held between Reverend Rufus and Reverend Augustus, created a stir in the village. The debate was very close to the day of the election. The supposed debate had political undertones. Inside the church, the radicals and the conservatives sat in separate groups. Radicals, including Felix Holt, who never was a churchgoer, lent their support to Rufus. Both the candidates sought to campaign amidst the debate. The candidates used clergymen to influence the election. Philip De Barry was supported by his uncle, Reverend Augustus De Barry. Harold, on the other hand, enlisted the support of his uncle, Reverend John Lingon and Reverend Rufus. The clergy actively participated in generating positive opinion for their candidates. Felix used religion to change Esther. He mocked at the difference between Esther and her father. The juxtaposition was one of the reasons for the transformation in Esther. Thus, religion was used for bringing change in both the individual as well as in the society. Now, let us discuss in detail the campaign and the election in Felix Holt the Radical. As Industrial Revolution altered the demography of Trevi Magna, the political situation in North Loamshire also changed. We have noted earlier that till the 1830s, North Loamshire was a rotten borough which elected only Tory candidates. The candidates regulated the voter list. Since most of the voters in the constituency were tenants, candidates easily bribed and blackmailed the voters and influenced the elections. The elections in 1832 was a complex affair. For the first time in the history of Trevi Magna, elections were influenced by national politics. Most of the voters were not tenants of the candidates. Thus, unlike in the previous elections, as Harold Transome revealed, the candidates could not buy votes at moderate rates. Hence, in 1832, candidates had to resort to a variety of methods to ensure that they got elected. Harold was the candidate of the Radical Party, while Debarry was supported by the Tory Party. Both the candidates enlisted the support of the family and the estate. Most of Philip's campaign was carried out by Maurice Christian. Harold engaged Matthew Jermyn, and in turn Jermyn employed John Johnson as the campaign manager. Johnson sought to build support for Harold amongst the workers. He visited the pubs, met their owners and built rapport with the workers. He regularly met the workers at the pub and paid for their drinks and asked them to canvass support for Harold. Instead of instilling radical ideas amongst the workers, Johnson got them to shout in favor of Harold. Johnson was not interested in spreading radicalism amongst the workers, but focused only on getting Harold elected. Candidates were also employed as pamphleteers and campaigners. Men who were not voters were bought to campaign. Tenants like Thomas Tronsome were employed as professional bill stickers. The clergy of the Anglican Church supported the conservative candidates, while the Puritans supported the radical candidate. Hence, for the first time in Trebi Magna, religion was also used to influence the election. On the day of the elections, candidates drove voters to polling booths. The drunken mine workers who belonged to Sproxton were made to assemble at the polling station supporting the candidates. The workers were drunk. They attacked the townspeople and destroyed property, and the police were forced to intervene. Riots occurred as the police and the workers clashed with each other. Felix tried to stop the riot and lead the workers away. However, he was caught in the riot and was responsible for the death of a police constable. Felix was always skeptical of the modes that John Johnson adopted. He reported Johnson's modes to Harold, yet Felix could not prevent the unruly incidents. 1832 marked a watershed year in the history of Trebi. For the first time in its history, it saw a tight contest. It also witnessed a transformation in the quality of its polity as Trebi's politics began to resemble the national politics of England. Thus, election became a turgid affair. Now, let us examine the significance of Felix Holt's address in the novel. In 1867, due to the efforts of Prime Minister Disraeli, the Second Reforms Bill became an act. George Eliot was asked by the editors of the Blackwood Journal to write an appropriate piece commemorating the legislation. Thus, the Address to Working Men by Felix Holt was written in 1867 and was published in January 1868. Subsequent editions of Felix Holt the Radical included the address in their appendix. The address is based on Holt's experience. Drawing on the events that happened in the novel, Felix Holt reminded the working class that not everything had been achieved. He admonished the working class for celebrating and congratulating themselves over the passage of the bill. Even as Holt addressed the need for further changes, he also informed the workers that reforms should not be confined to politics alone, but should take place in every realm of human life. Holt informed the working classes that they need to be patient and wise. He stated that every traditional practice is not redundant. He stated that there was no need to reform practices just because they are conventional. He urged that men should judge the situations and eliminate or reform only those processes that are regressive. He stressed on the need for working class men to study diligently and think clearly before they come up with alternative practices. Quoting from his past experience, Holt pointed out that even evil men can appropriate progressive ideas to further their own goals. He argued that it is the duty of the working class to rein in such men. The address becomes significant on many counts. It explicitly states the political affiliation of the protagonist. The address seems very similar to the discourse that was being disseminated by the 19th century Whigs. It proves that Eliot was a supporter of liberal causes. It vindicates that Eliot was neither with the Tories nor with the Whigs. The address seems to be talking to revolutionaries who were blinded by rhetoric. Dear learners, we have concluded our lessons on Felix Holt the Radical. I hope that you enjoyed the novel and the lessons.